Damien described it as an ethos. Some of the textbooks call it a transformative research framework, which is a bit kind of posh academic language, I suppose. And it goes along with, as Damien said, emancipatory research, feminist research, community-based research. Research that's kind of placed somewhere between a method and a methodology, an approach to research that is designed, intended to explicitly be more ethical, to move away from the do no harm ethics approach that social science has certainly inherited from biomedical research, but which doesn't really fit, because actually we all do the work we do because we want to make the world a better place. We're not trying to be neutral, we're not pretending to be objective, or even that there's any such thing as objectivity. We're aiming for increased social justice. And participatory research has a potential role to play in helping us to do that. However, it's not perfect. We've heard that already from Damien. It has limitations. It's a research approach that has limitations. Yet from a lot of the literature, you wouldn't know that. From a lot of what is written about participatory research, you would think that if anybody embarks on a participatory research project, bluebirds will start singing, rainbows will shine, everybody will love each other, and the world will be a happy place. But it actually doesn't, I hate to disappoint you, but you know what, it really does not work that way. And yet it's so rarely critiqued. We need to recognise the limitations of this method. We need to recognise the new ethical problems that participatory research can bring with it. We need to acknowledge those, we need to address those problems. So there's one book, I'm going to give you an example of how not critiqued participatory research can be. There's a big fat book which is actually called Participatory Action Research. It's by a couple of Canadians who've worked in this field for years. It's based on about 10 years of work. It's actually a really good, thorough book, which I would recommend in many ways. However, for a start, there's not a word of critique or limitation in the whole, I don't know, 450 pages or whatever it is. It's a doorstop-sized book. And for a second thing, it has an index. It has a good index. This is a good thing. I like a good index in a research book. Very helpful. In the text of the book, research participants aren't mentioned by name, which I guess is an ethical approach. Academics are mentioned by name, the usual citation approach, brackets, Blogs and Bingley 2012, or whatever it is. Participants are referred to as, for example, the forestry worker or the restaurant cook. They're referred to by descriptions of a role that they play in the world, in society. And when you come to the index, Blogs and Bingley are there, the forestry worker's not in the index. How participatory is that? It's a problem. We need to be looking for these lacunae in the whole participatory research canon and addressing them and arguing about them. I think this is really important. One big implication of the whole participatory research thing is that everyone can participate. It's all equal, level playing field. No, it's not. I don't really need to tell you this, this particular constituency, this particular audience. But another thing I think we need to fight, which again Damien's already started on the path of doing, is the way that words can make us all seem the same when we're not. Like autistic people. Autistic people are all the same as each other, aren't they? No, neurotypical people, thank you for noticing. Neurotypical people aren't all the same as each other either. I'm technically neurotypical, although some of my friends just reckon there isn't yet a label for what kind of person I am. Very lovely friends I have. So participatory research doesn't necessarily enable equality. It doesn't necessarily enable equal access to the process. It doesn't necessarily reduce power imbalances, let alone removing them. It may reduce and address power imbalances within the research team, but whether that extends beyond the research process is highly arguable. Sometimes it may not. And what effect it has. So there's a really lovely type of participatory method developed from, I think, Barcelona in Spain, early in this century, called critical communicative methodology. Bit of a mouthful, sorry about that. The key point of this is that everyone has expertise that is of value to the research process. That's something I think we can all sign up to that. And researchers using this method wanted to work with the Roma community in mainland Europe, the very, very marginalised, Europe's nomadic peoples who are, have very limited access to health services, housing, education, low levels of educational attainment, all sorts of things that make their lives difficult, and lots of discrimination in the world, on the street, in the classroom, on the bus, everywhere really. And the critical community, I'm going to call it CCM, okay, the CCM people did work over years with Roma people in a very highly participatory and good and positive way, which culminated in Roma people presenting the findings of this research at the European Parliament, and the people at the European Parliament listened and changed the laws to give Roma people more rights, more concrete, solid rights to accessing services that they struggle to access, and to having a better quality of life in mainland Europe. Ta-da! Fantastic. A few years later, some other researchers went along to investigate what difference this had made to Roma people's lives in mainland Europe. None. Which is pretty depressing. What I'm not saying is participatory research is rubbish, don't bother doing it. I think it has a lot to offer potentially in the right context. Like any research method, I think it's really important that you start from what your research question is, and then look at what methods, approaches, methodologies are going to best help you answer that question. I think using participatory research as a knee-jerk, or just because you like it, isn't necessarily the best way to work in a research field. So generally, that's about all I have to say, but thank you for listening. Oh. But yes, a couple of questions maybe.
Yes, I just wanted to see if anyone had a question. Yes, at the back.
Hi, I was wondering if you ever, whether you did research about how the word participatory work also function in research applications, etc.
Well, as an independent researcher, I don't have to do them.
No, you don't have to do them, but how is it used by governments, etc., to get money for others than for you? But how does the work function also on a legal level, on an institutional level, and what does it mean and what does it not mean?
Okay, that was about 6 questions, I think. And I'm not sure I'm qualified to answer any of them because I work outside of institutions. I'm independent, which means I work by myself in a little office in my garden, in fact, when I'm not doing things like this. I think your questions are important questions, and it may well be that other people on this panel are more better equipped to answer them. I'm looking at you guys now. But I don't know that I can help you there, unless anybody else has an answer or a thought on that. We very quickly, Damien, yes.
It's used in different ways in different disciplines, I think. So what participation means to the Medical Research Council is quite different to a sociologist or an artist or something. So the word can mean different things in different contexts, and we have to be wary of that.
I think that's really helpful. Are you adding a point or asking a new question?
Both.
1 second then, if I may. I think that's a really helpful point. The health service in the UK do this thing called patient and public involvement, PPI, which is pretty tokenistic, generally speaking. In terms of the UK government, I've never heard anyone from the UK government ask anyone to do participatory research. They seem to be much more interested in randomised controlled trials, which are also an excellent method in the right context. But the government, the UK government currently seems to have this sort of hierarchy of method thing going on and want randomised controlled trials for everything, even where they don't really apply. So maybe that's a partial answer, and maybe you can have a bit more of the answer from this person.
Well, the first thing is that I'm an anthropologist, and so my discipline actually has a long tradition of looking at minority and disenfranchised groups. It's actually famous for doing that, not necessarily in the most ethical of ways, in our early research. And so for so many years we've bandied around, or kind of the term that we love to use when we're talking about research, participant observation. As we used to just observe as an outsider, now we participate. And in light of the anthropological context, if I had to justify what the difference between that and participatory research is, there's no actual strong divide. And because we have this history, and especially American anthropology, has a history of collaborative research with Native American tribes. It started as research into Native American tribes, and then that's how the whole American branch of anthropology kind of existed. There's a big difference between participation and collaboration. And there's, I guess, institutional not impacts of it, not impacts, consequences of this. Because collaboration, you're assigning authorship to another person. And I mean, there's also, are they qualified to assign, have authorship? But also academics are kind of, we have to publish papers. We have to publish papers, and that actually remain academics. And we've used this term like participation and collaboration in the same way, when they're kind of not the same thing. Anyone can participate in research if you take the word to be a basis term. Going to an interview is participating in research. Collaboration is implying a level of equality or more authoritative access to authorship of the work. So, I mean, that's a point, but also, I guess, what is your take on this as well?
What's my take on it?
Yeah, anyone's take on it.
Well, I think that was very articulately expressed. I don't know that I have I think you can have one of these for that. Yeah, that was really good. Just bear with me whilst I'm keeping my technical things. So Helen doesn't like PowerPoint. I'm an academic, so I can't give a talk without PowerPoint. Yeah.
First of all, thank you so much for inviting me here today. It's a really, really brilliant event. I have been asked to talk about how we adopt participatory practices within our centre, CRAE, Centre for Research in Autism Education at UCL. And actually I wear a couple of hats in terms of participatory research, because as well as advocating for participatory research in the autism field, I actually kind of moonlight outside the autism field in a different area of medical research as a kind of expert by experience. So I participate as someone who takes part in studies. I've been involved as a kind of consultant and advisor, and I've collaborated in a more kind of co-production way on bids, and have done research in that respect. So I think that's very much influenced the way that we approach our participatory work at CRAE.
I'll just bring up
I'm pressing it's just a little arrow.
Yeah.
That thing there. Okay. Oh, okay. Right. So earlier Damien spoke about participatory research as a kind of ethos, and I think that's what we have at CRAE. So in terms of our mission, we want to conduct high quality research, but importantly we want that research to have a positive impact on the lives of autistic children, young people and adults. And we also want to ensure that we really meaningfully engage the autistic and also broader autism community, so teachers, parents, in the way that we do the research within our centre. And this was really inspired by a piece of work that was done by two of our former directors, Liz Pellicano and Tony Charman, called A Future Made Together, which again Damien referenced earlier. So this was a big consultation exercise asking people what they thought about the autism research that was being funded and the autism research that was being published. And it showed this big mismatch with the autism research taking place not really having much, if any, of an impact on the day-to-day lives of autistic people as perceived by the community. And there was also involved meaningfully in research, you know, taking part in research but not having a say in the research that's taking place. And one of the things that I quite like, that links on really nicely from the point that we had in response to Helen's talk, was that participative kind of involvement or participation in research doesn't just take one form. You know, not everybody wants to co-produce a piece of research. research, or fully immerse themselves in a kind of participatory way. And actually it's really important that we give people lots of options in the way that they can engage with the research that we do. And I'm just going to talk to you and give you a few examples of the way that we do some of these within our centre. So in terms of dissemination, I think one of the things that's most helpful for us is in terms of social media. So being able to tell people about the work that we're doing, get ideas, get input, and really kind of, I think it came up in one of the earlier talks about how researchers don't really immerse themselves in autistic culture, and I think this is one of the nice ways in which you can kind of do that, even as from kind of outsider. Have lots of newsletters to send out about our work. We do big public events that people can come along to, hear about research, engage in discussion, and things like film screenings, so kind of less academic and less intimidating perhaps. Come and watch a film, have a discussion about autism at the end. Try and put ourselves out there in the press as much as possible to engage in these kind of wider debates. But this is all very kind of one way, telling people about things. So we also try to engage in kind of more dialogue. And a lot of this is through the kind of events that we put on, similar to this in a way. This is one that we did at King's a couple of years ago called Ought to Engage, trying to think about how early career researchers in particular can be encouraged to involve the community in the research. And also we do things like work experience placements for autistic students. You can come and find out more about research, give us input, and hopefully get some skills that they can take away. And then kind of moving one step forward, partnership. So we're not an autistic-led centre, but we do have autistic staff and students who work with us. And actually one of my favourite parts of my job is supporting them to do their research on topics that interest them. I very much see myself as a kind of, my expertise is not in autism, my expertise is in research, and to help support people to do the research that they want. But we do lots of kind of co-produced research, and this is a project that we did with Jack Welsh, Georgia Harper and Fern Adams, who are part of Ambitious About Autism's Youth Council, a project on mental health. And something that came up earlier was about everything being kind of perfect in participatory research, and it's not, and it has lots of challenges. And one of the things we tried to do in this project in particular was to do some blogs and to do some videos where we spoke more openly about some of those challenges that came up during the research and how we tried to overcome them. We also don't just engage with autistic people in co-producing research. This is a network that I run called the Pan London Autism Schools Network Research Group, and it's for senior leaders of autism special schools across London who want to do more research and want to be supported in carrying out their own research, and they're really keen to be involved in research as well. And I think representativeness came up earlier with participation, and these are a group of children in these schools who are often excluded from taking part in research. So in addition to their autism diagnoses, they often have learning disability and challenges in communicating verbally as well. And I think it's really important that we try to engage this group in research a lot more. And just a little plug for the Centre for Co-Production in Health Research. This kind of doesn't exist because it's being co-produced, but it's a centre that aims to have co-production in heart and to support people in doing these collaborative projects and to try and be more open and transparent about how to do them. And one of the things that has happened is that we've got some money to give out pilot grants, and actually one, I tweeted about it this morning, that's been funded is an autistic-led project on mental health as well. So that looks very exciting, and I'll be keen to see how that develops. I mentioned to Helen in the break that one thing that we've done quite recently is to do a piece of research looking at participation in autism research. We've interviewed some established autism researchers, some early career researchers about their views and experiences of participatory working. And early career researchers in particular spoke about how they knew that this was something that, you know, is the kind of buzzword, everyone's talking about it, but they don't really know how to go about it. They're not even really sure what it is, and I think it links to the point earlier about all of these terms that are being bandied around and we don't have these clear definitions of kind of what counts and what doesn't. And it is hard if, as Damien says, you know, it is an ethos, it's not a prescribed set of methods. But they did talk about this lack of confidence in taking this forward and not really knowing where to start. So as part of the Shaping Autism Research Group, we put together a starter pack that you can download off the website, and it just gives a few ideas of how you can be involved in disseminating your work, in engaging in those dialogues, and in, if you chose to do so and if it was appropriate for that context, doing some collaborative co-design research, or helping the autistic community to lead their own research. So thank you very much.
Okay, so do we have any questions? Yes.
Thank you very much for that, Laura. I suppose this is a kind of general question, maybe about. Are you aware of how easy it is for researchers to disclose as being autistic themselves?
Yeah, it's a very tricky issue. So it's a very personal thing as to whether to disclose or not disclose as to whether you're autistic. We have had situations on projects where we have collaborated with people who are autistic and do not want to declare that diagnosis. And it can pose challenges because often you advertise your project and people want to know if it has autistic input. And sometimes it does, but you don't want to be open about it. And I know from my personal experience, where I kind of do kind of my moonlighting, I don't talk about it openly as well for personal reasons. And I think we have to respect that, but I think it is difficult because people do want you to transparently set out the involvement that you have.
I suppose really I was asking the question, I mean of course it has to be a personal decision, but I suppose I was wondering what you felt about why it should be difficult, you know, because that's the issue, isn't it? I mean, I was an academic researcher before I got a diagnosis, and it took me a while to disclose, and when I did I asked quite a lot of people what they thought, and the professionals all told me not to disclose. Or said, well, and actually in the end I asked my children and they said, well, you've got to, and I went, yeah, okay. So that's really why I was asking the question, was just whether you have any thoughts about why it should be difficult for people working in academic research in autism to disclose that they're actually autistic.
Yeah, I mean, my kind of experience in terms of disclosure comes from, I do a lot of work kind of in criminal justice, and people worry about discrimination, and I really, you know, hear those concerns, and I think that is a big barrier. But yeah, we do have the situation where a lot of people choose not to disclose. That's their choice. But I do think, I agree, I think it's not a very nice situation that, you know, there is perhaps that stigma and fear of discrimination that means people may not disclose.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question.
Just to add to a point to that, because I've had conversations with colleagues who have disclosed to me personally, some people don't disclose publicly because they're worried that they will then be asked to take on the job of representing all autistic people in every piece of research they do, and they want their work to stand for itself and not because they are the autistic academic in the team. So some people are worried about stigma, and some people are almost worried about the opposite, of almost an idealisation question, I think.
It becomes the marginalisation as well.
Yeah. All scientists that are neurotypical, would they ever think to do that? Oh, I'm not speaking, because no one's speaking for everyone. I just think it's interesting that if you disclose you're autistic, then supposedly you're speaking for all autistic people, whereas someone who's neurotypical wouldn't ever think that they were speaking for all neurotypical people. That needs to change.
Isn't that just a big minority thing, though?
Yeah.
If you're a black researcher, you're suddenly representing all black people.
Yes.
Millions across the world, you're just everyone.
Yeah, yeah.
But I do think other minority groups have made strategies to counteract this. I mean, my research is all about intersectionality, people who are autistic and something else. So we could probably look into strategies about how other people have dealt with it. can shut up now, okay?
Okay, yeah, thank you. So if we can have...
Great, thanks for the invitation. So, as Hannah suggested, so I'm a clinician primarily. So I'm a child and adolescent psychiatrist. I work clinically with actually a range of children and young people and families, but for this particular purpose, children, autistic adolescents, but not adults and families. And so that's my clinical interaction, which I've been doing for 30 plus years in the field. And then the research that I've particularly channeled into, which I'm going to have a dialogue with you about, hopefully, is around intervention research. And so as an academic, I'm involved in intervention science internationally, thinking about how to formulate and test interventions for the autistic community, particularly young people. So this is not related to adults. And so within that context, I just want to kind of lay open some things around intervention research with you. Obviously, our context here is around participatory research, so I'm just going to emphasize some of the aspects that I think are kind of current. We are certainly, I would say, a long way behind Cray and Lara's kind of activity in the sophistication with which we do this. But really, me being here is part of me just saying, okay, let's open it up and see what kind of dialogue we can have. So this is just to give you a sense of where I come from as a clinician in my research work, so in my intervention work. So you understand what I mean by intervention, because in itself this has become, I know, and you know, sometimes a controversial kind of area. So I come at intervention from the point of view of a developmental scientist thinking about transactional theory and individual difference, i.e. everyone's born different, and we grow up and we form our capacity, our identities, and our lives out of the way we interact with the environment as we grow up. And that's true, in my view, for people with autism as well as it is for so-called neurotypicals. And these transactions are all sorts of kinds, and for autistics, of course, this brings with it strengths and vulnerabilities and in those interactions. And we could talk about all that for a long time, which I'm not going to, because that's not my remit today, and I've got a short time. But it's in that context that I think about intervention, is how we can think about the transactions, which are two-way processes, in a way that's going to help the lives of children and families grow. So, and I want to think about these just very briefly in three little components: early years, school years, and then bring it into the room, really, in terms of adulthood. So, the work that we've done in early years really has to do with these early transactions that are the foundation for all human beings, I think, and well, actually mammals as well, for many aspects of later developmental capacity, and that includes autistic development. And essentially what we try and do in our interventions, which are work with parents and not with the children themselves. This is very different to child-focused behavioral type therapies. This is working with the parents in a naturalistic context. Why is that? Because in these very early years, the nature of the transaction is of course two-way, but the parents are probably the part of the transactional system, if you like, that it's easiest to engage with and most relevant to engage with. So we do parent-mediated, as we call it, interventions. Now that in itself brings up some ethical and interesting issues, because, and I know this has been discussed, it's like, in whose interest is the intervention happening? In the parent's interest, who may or may not be autistic themselves, of course, or the child's interest, who, as with all pediatric therapy, don't have the capacity for consent, and nor do they have the capacity to decide what's done in their interest. So in this sense, working with young children with autism is no different to working in any other pediatric population. They don't have a say. So this is parent-led work at this in the early years, and but there is an issue there about parent priorities and what other people may intuit as child priorities, and that's something for discussion, I think. Anyway, so we've worked for many years on these kinds of intervention strategies. We've worked on them particularly with quantitative methods. So one of my passionate feelings is that within intervention science, the autistic community has been disadvantaged by the poor nature of the methods and the level of marketing of interventions that's often gone on around the world based on poor evidence. And so one of my kind of raison d'etre as a clinical scientist is to actually try and use the best methods we can to test these interventions within a biomedical context. So I'm really talking kind of tough, hard RCT type science, which I think you can do with this kind of thing. That's part of our remit. And we've shown, you know, some good effects of this kind of approach on the children's development, on family life. But that's not really the point of my presentation today. It's to think about, if we're trying to open up this kind of work, which we've been doing for a long time now, to a more participatory dialogue, interaction, what kind of things would we need to do? So one thing that we did right from the get-go is we wanted to find out from parents about what their priorities for research outcomes would be. Because, of course, what the intervention aims to do is a key ethical issue. It's not neutral. You know, what you choose to change, what you think should be changed, etc. So what we did from the beginning of our work, so this is going back to the early 2000s, is to engage with parents of children with autism to ask them what they thought the right outcomes for a research method for to test interventions would be. And we ran focus groups, individual interviews, online kind of consultation type exercises, which was mediated by the National Autistic Society. And distilled it all down, and we created this instrument that was supposed to be part of our outcome battery, if you like, of testing the effect of our interventions. And this is called the AFEQ, Autism Family Engagement Questionnaire. It's published now in JAD, one of the autism journals, a couple of years ago. And I put that up to say, well, we've done something. It was a beginning. And it was quite interesting, actually, what parents said was their research goals. And you may or may not, I mean, just very broadly speaking, they were highly normative. So that actually what a lot of parents wanted was their kids to be able to go to birthday parties with other kids in their class. And they were pained at the social exclusion of their kids. They were pained at the distress that that caused, and they wanted in some way to get to a situation where their kids could be more integrated and their families could be more integrated, for instance, with their siblings. So there are priorities in there, and they were, in this case, priorities from parents. Well, we do other kinds of outcomes, which are more traditional, parent reports, research-rated outcomes, which we use in the RCTs, and to try and measure what we call well-being or quality of life. And it's one of the nearly scandals in our field, particularly in child disability and autism and child intellectual disability, that there is no measure that has been developed within the national context for quality of life. And so-called quality of life is very important in the general scheme of the way that the NHS and the sort of biomedical powers that be think about, NICE committee, etc., think about interventions. And so whether or not it's the best thing, it's an important thing politically to get equity. We don't have an instrument of that kind at the moment, and that's an important gap which we need to fill. So we've tried to do proxies, and of course we need to look at mental health and along with well-being. So these issues around what we measure when we look at interventions in terms of how we judge whether they're successful or not to mention how we formulate the interventions themselves, which is another question, are ripe for a more participatory approach, and I think we recognise that. But I'm still committed to keeping within if you like, the biomedical, or at least the sort of health paradigm of health intervention science, because that's what gives us traction politically. If I go to the government, I need to be able to quote this kind of evidence for equity. Then, moving on, the kids in the early school years are exposed to a wider set of transactions than just their family, of course, and that includes education environments, peer environments, social environments. And we need to think in a systematic way too about how we can do interventions in those environments that really work in the way we want them to work. And one current project we're doing is the so-called PAC-G, where we're actually doing these adult carer-mediated interventions in the school with the teachers as a way of trying to alert the teachers to the communication needs of the children and get better access to the curriculum. We're just about to finish that trial, and that's going to be quite interesting to see what we find. Working in schools has been a real challenge. So again, there are issues here for participatory research in terms of how we actually formulate the outcomes in an education environment. What would you say, for instance, would be a good thing to measure if we were trying to test whether a particular intervention within an education environment was successful? And these are questions for us to think about together, because measurement is key. It makes a lot of difference. So the final thing I wanted to do is to bring us, as it were, up to age and into the room in terms of us as adults thinking together, and the notion of intersubjectivity. So when as a clinician I am interacting, trying to be with, trying to help as far as I'm able an autistic adult, I, like any other, in any other context in psychiatry or mental health, I need to try and understand their mind. I need to develop a kind of intersubjectivity with them. And insofar as we develop a therapeutic relationship with the aim of helping their lives develop, them and their lives develop, it's a mutual aspect within the therapy. So therapies are intersubjective spaces, they're co-constructed. And the notion of how we can then, how I, as let's say a neurotypical adult who thinks in a particular kind of way, can interact with an autistic adult. And of course, there isn't just one, as everyone said, and of course that's true. It's one of the big problems of our language. But part of the glories of the clinical space is that you don't have to be constrained by that language. You can just be with another person in all their uniqueness, but understanding that there may be particular characteristics of their thinking and feeling style which you need to understand. And that's a real challenge for us clinically. So what kind of work here is useful? And this, I think, from my point of view, is a whole different area of interest, which is that we need a much better, what I would call a much better phenomenology of autistic thinking and states of mind. And I use phenomenology because it's in my universe of phenomenological psychiatry, which is a great tradition in psychiatry. But basically what it's talking about is actually being aware of and taking seriously and really trying to understand people's experience. So it's the lived experience thing. and that's all phenomenology really means. But it's just holding it, theoretically as far as one's able, but really trying to understand that at an interpersonal, intersubjective level. So we need a better way of coming together to develop a shared understanding of the phenomenology of practice. And how is that to be made representative? Because people have commented on this before, that all autistic adults are different. They may be, people are particularly vocal, have particular qualities and strengths that may not be representative of the whole autistic community. So how do we make it at least partly representative? How do we do that? And I think some systematic work, as well as the ideographic person to person, but some more systematic work of that kind would be really important. And then, as I said, and coming back to the previous points, to actually think together about what goals for change would be, what actually autistic adults would want for their lives, and how that would be, and how much is in our remit as a health service, and of course the social activism, which is part of the transaction, obviously. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much, and see if there's any dialogue that would be useful.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. So are there any questions from the floor? Yeah. I think in interacting with the autistic community, basically one of the frustrations that we feel is people outside the autistic experience that are being asked for what is their incentive, what is the goal, what is the priority. And often we're seeing a lot of, like, as you mentioned, they want them to go to birthday parties, they want them to make eye contact, they want them to be able to participate. Whereas autistics are saying things like, we want our welfare and our mental health and our pain and our physical health addressed. We want holistic approaches, we want our sensory systems recognised, we want to be taught how to stim, how to regulate, how to stay out of overload, how to maintain calm. Because if we're supposed to be disordered in the social, emotional and communication, I don't understand why the intervention keeps being behaviourist. And I think autistics would love more of a consultation and a say, to be able to say what are our incentives for intervention, what would help us.
No, quite, and it's where there's an age issue here, which for me as a paediatric psychiatrist, I have a family becoming the word, right? And the child doesn't refer him or herself, it's the family who refer. And there is a negotiation here about what the goals and the areas of focus should be, and of course we have an input into that. It's not just what the parents want.
But what I mean by that is, instead of just the parents, you talking to the parents, I mean the NHS, the medical community as a whole, don't talk to the autistics. So that's why you're only able to apply that knowledge in the general practitioner room. But I'm asking for why.
Partly what I'm doing now, but it's like, so I think we are learning and adapting, or we should be, all the time. I think my point is this, that for all autistic adults have been autistic children, right? And there are some wonderful accounts of what it's like to be a child with autism that I've learned an awful lot from. And I think someone was mentioning, can you believe these accounts? I find a lot of those accounts hugely kind of affecting and convincing. And they're different, because people are different. So it's true, we've all been kids, all of us. It's like, how do we set the priorities for what we should be doing with a 3-year-old in a family context? Particularly when actually we want to help the family help the kid.
I mean,
not modifying the behaviour would be a start.
Yeah. As soon as you said the idea of, okay, a child going to a birthday party, as an autistic person, I thought, okay, the community needs to be needs an intervention, not the child. But the community around them, the people that go to that birthday party, need the intervention. They need to learn and be educated about autistic people and their experience, and what is best for the autistic child. So for me, I kind of turned it around, but the intervention needs to go out, disseminated throughout the community as a whole. The language that people use to describe autistic people, the idea that all autistic people what you're saying. That actually those interventions need to go not towards the autistic person to a certain extent, but to the understanding.
Yeah, so I totally take that, but of course, transaction goes both ways. So I think that we can help the child's resilience as well as we can educate the community. And there are both things that are important.
But autistic people, and throughout their lifetime, probably get better at this, work very, 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 very hard to fit into the neurotypical world, to communicate in a way that is acceptable, to act in a way that is acceptable. And obviously that's much more difficult for autistic children or people with co-occurring conditions. But I think we do work very, very hard in that two-way street, and I think what needs to happen is that non-autistic people might need to work a little bit harder to catch up with that.
Okay.
And Damien's
just on the question, the quality of life well-being as a measure problem, I've been banging on about that one for as long as I've been involved in the field, and there's been very little movement. I think there's a project Helen McConaughey and people in Newcastle did, but it was a well-being questionnaire without for more able autistic people. So there's still, and that's just one study, and there's huge gaps there. So what do you think we can do as a community to drive that forwards, as so we do have good quality of life measures in the research? Because for me the problem with a lot of the trials is the outcome measures are measuring things which are not appropriate really. So all this expensive research is being done for measures we don't even want.
Well, yeah, quite. So that's my main point of what I was saying. I mean, so there is quite a lot of.
We do.
I think there is quite a lot. There are two, if you like, intersecting problems. One is childhood, because actually there are no good pediatric quality measures for really young kids at all. But it's also developmentally challenged or different kids, autistic kids, there isn't anything specific. And developing it isn't actually, I thought it'd be much easier than it was. I was involved in Helen McConaughey's project, and it's been very slow progress. So what can we do? I think that it's actually a political priority, this. And we ought to gather together to put pressure from, as it were, both sides, to say actually there needs to be some really concerted effort funded to produce something like this which will work. And we can do it. I mean, these things are all solvable. They just need concerted effort and funding. So I think that it just could be a political priority to get something. And people often think, oh, these are so crude, these quality of life measures. And it's true, but it's politically they're very useful in terms of driving agendas in the NHS. So yeah, I'd say we ought to work together at it, and we'll get there.
I'm really sorry, I'm just going to pause that there because I'm aware that we've hit 1:30. So maybe if the panel don't mind, we could perhaps stay just 5 minutes in case there are questions directed to the whole panel. But if anyone wanted to go out for lunch, you're more than welcome to now, or we can stay if there's any overall question.
Sure. So I'm picking up on your kind of concluding remark about the need for phenomenology of autistic thinking. I think you're right, but I wonder whether actually making that more phenomenological would be better. Thinking actually in terms of autistic being in the world. Because I think sometimes there's a temptation to think about just what's going on in the skull, whereas of course there are dimensions of autistic sociality, of communication, of sensory aspects, and I think they need to be understood as intersecting and relating to one another. So that, I guess that's more of a comment, but I was wondering what you thought about that.
No, I totally agree. I mean, the mind is not, it's stuck in the skull. We're interacting. We are being in the world, and it's how that works is the key issue.
On the next panel, I think.
Oh. Yes, okay.
Can you tell us what your understanding is of how autistic people feel about Autism Speaks? We're just sitting here wondering why it's in the presentation.
Oh, thank you for that. Okay. Yes. So, okay, thank you for the question. Yes, so Autism Speaks funded the, when we did our initial UK trials of our therapy, there was an idea that we would do these in India or South Asia, India and Pakistan, that we would adapt them and translate them in that domain. And Autism Speaks at that time were running a thing called the Autism Global Public Health Program, where they were interested in fostering autism research globally around the world. And they had a funding call, and we applied for it and we got the money. So Autism Speaks is up there because they funded us to do that work. And in fact, that work led to a huge amount. So we're now doing a very big program in India of this kind of therapy with kids in India after we'd done it in southern India and Pakistan as well. So I'm well aware of how many autistic people feel about Autism Speaks. I myself am highly critical of their support, for instance, for ABA, which I think is, I've been very vocally critical of. So, yeah, so it's an interesting dilemma. So they funded us, so you kind of recognise your funding on, when you do these things. But I'm well aware of the paradoxes and difficulties about that. And I would also say about Autism Speaks that, they're not a homogeneous organisation in a sense. They look lots of different directions. The Global Public Health Programme, led by a guy called Andy Shee, has actually been really outward-looking, compassionate. He's been hugely energetic in trying to meet the needs of autistic individuals around the world. So I would kind of support his work, and I know he's uncomfortable with some of the other things that go on in the organisation.
That's good to hear that there's an individual who can do that. I'm thinking, for a parent who sees that, that they're going to think that that's an okay organisation, and they're not going to know the horrific things that happen, and how autistic adults actually are horrified by it and just don't want anything to do with Autism Speaks. I don't know a single autistic adult who feels comfortable with them at all, and it's quite distressing actually to see it on the poster.
Okay, well, yeah, no, I'm sorry it's, that it triggered that feeling in you. I mean, all I can say is that the fact is they funded us.
Well, it might be good to just recognise that. So say, okay, I know Autism Speaks is up here. This is why it's there. I understand that, and I don't support a lot of the things that they do.
Yeah. No.
Yeah. So to just add that into your talk.
Yeah. Thank you. That's a fair point.
Yes. I know that autistic mentors are used within, I guess, some non-autistic researchers trying to kind of gain more insight. It's very positive. Kind of open question to the panel. Do you think that's something that should be instituted across many more non-autistic researchers, especially autism?
I would think if people are researching autism, then that would be a really key primary way of working. And it's paralleled in other areas of research. So, for example, Indigenous researchers in Australia work with non-Indigenous researchers who are interested in Indigenous people's ways of life or issues or whatever it is. So I think it's a model that would be potentially useful in autism research, but also is proving useful in other contexts, similar contexts too, that we might take on that.
I do have someone who I deem to be my mentor as well. We work very closely together. We actually started working with her because she complained about something that I did. So I organised an event, and there wasn't as many autistic people as there could have been. And I kind of got back to her and explained why it was structured the way it was. And she actually thanked me because I was the first researcher who'd ever replied to one of her complaints, and I think that says a lot. But we ended up working together on quite a few projects. I did an evaluation of autistic mental support group for those who recently identified as autistic or have been diagnosed as autistic. We did a report that helped them get some more funding to keep that going, and it's kind of a reciprocal relationship in that way. And I found it hugely helpful. She's not afraid to tell me if I do something wrong, and I think I need that.
Yeah. I think that's really important to have that reciprocal relationship where you have someone telling you it's not right or it should be done maybe slightly differently, and actually taking that on board, because I think so often people don't listen or they kind of half listen, and actually you need to take it very, very seriously and respond.
So I just say, I mean, we all have blind spots, so I've just demonstrated one just now, and I have, I've been hugely, I feel privileged to have had a couple of people who've really had mentored me and told me on certain times what they think about stuff, and supported me at other times. So I think that kind of model that we've used, in a way I've been encouraged to continue, partly because it's feedback I've had from people who've come to this community, sometimes reservations, but it's broadly.
Okay, so I'm just going to say thank you very much to the panel and to all your contributions as well.